There is a lot more we can do to create jobs which tap into intrinsic interest, and that fundamentally is a sophistication around job matching, matching people's skills, their passion, their competence, their potential with what an employer can offer. Herzberg made a very famous quote once, which I think is absolutely true now, much more than ever before. If you want someone to do a good job, then give them a good job to do. New pay effectively succeeded a previous system that was better fit for purpose in the context of, certainly in the case of Britain, our manufacturing and engineering intensive industry, replacing that in the 1980s, 90s and 2000s with a service-based economy, much like the United States, for example. And there you find that actually the new pay, which is an attempt to create alignment organisationally using pay mechanisms such as base pay, incentives, often performance-based, and that alignment allows senior managers at the corporate level to effectively drive behaviours corporately. And that's a huge advantage. It's the idea of almost the chief executive having available to him a lever through which he can determine workforce behaviours on a mass basis. And at heart, that's the logic of the new pay. But what that requires necessarily is hierarchical organisation. It requires power concentrated at the top. It requires relatively predictable and known factors around which you can formally plan and actually use pay as that lever. And I think that's being challenged progressively. And so we are at a tipping point because our organisations are becoming flatter. In fact, not just flatter, they are becoming more networks and they are hierarchies. More than ever before, planning is giving way to some sense of emergent strategy within organisations that emphasise not just performance but also change as well, and are really struggling to manage that tricky trade-off between flexibility on the one hand and efficiency on the other. So for me, the interesting thing is that actually we've seen this progression throughout the last 100 years, and I think we're at another tipping point where we're actually moving away from this idea of using pay as a strategic tool, as a lever for senior managers, to actually something which is better fit for purpose in the context of the network-based information age organisation. The structure of employment is changing, has to change. Now, of course, a caveat on that is not a uniform development across the world. There are very many people, the majority, in fact, who work in relatively low-skilled, repetitive task-driven roles, and pay there is essentially what it looked like in Britain during the 1950s and 60s. But certainly in the West, certainly in developing knowledge economies and how that's being transported throughout the world through a process of globalisation, I think the nature of work is changing. It's a fundamental fact. Work is less secure than it once was. I think our MBA graduates don't leave school, their degrees, with the expectation that they'll have a job for life. I mean, it's almost a complete improbability. Actually, what they expect is to have a number of employers, and through their employers, they can practice what it is they're passionate about, which is making a difference. So in a sense, employers become a vehicle for personal influence. And I think the next logical progression is, instead of a sequential in a sense, migration from one employer to another throughout one's career, actually I think the train will be far more that we will work for multiple employers at the same time, fulfilling a portfolio of tasks and responsibilities. And necessarily it has to be individually driven. The implication of that is, how do you reward that? How do you recognise success? How do you, in a sense, recognise performance? What does performance even look like? And where will that sense of security come from? And it also implies a radically different skill set, again, at the individual level, but within the context of organisations and what they require for success in the increasingly intensely competitive environments in which they find themselves. The essential equation is not about how you get pay right in the strategic sense, which is the focus of the new pay, but rather how do you avoid getting it wrong? How do you avoid creating a sense of unfairness within the workforce, so that actually the result of that is conflict, either between individuals within work or actually, most importantly, between the individual and their employer. For me, one thing that we've potentially lost, particularly from an HR perspective, but actually also from a leadership perspective as well, and particularly in the context of designing jobs and creating, in a sense, work routines which are aligned both to strategy but also to talent, is that fundamentally people want to believe in something bigger than themselves. I have to believe that people will identify with something which is bigger than just purely their own personal fulfillment and self-interest. And in many respects, it is then therefore incumbent upon organisational leaders, whether they're policymakers or chief executives or otherwise, to create the environments in which individuals and groups can really flourish and contribute to something that they identify with as being fundamentally a positive difference to the world. And I believe that is a powerful force that we don't nearly tap into enough. And again, the fundamental issue there is we should not use pay as a crutch to address some of the lack of meaning or the loss of meaning that we're experiencing through driving, punishing performance regimes as we are in our organisations. Fundamentally, organisations are humanistic. They always have been and they always will be, and that's a source for good and one that we should tap into and manage very smartly going forward, because otherwise we simply will not be fit for purpose otherwise.